Today we're joined by Michael Ruck, a partner at K&L Gates in London and head of the firm's EU-UK sanctions team. Michael brings a deep experience in financial crime, regulatory investigations, sanctions, fraud, compliance, including nearly 6 years with the Financial Conduct Authority. He advises companies and senior leaders navigating some of the most complex enforcement and risk issues facing businesses today. Michael, welcome to Crushing It.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Thanks for having me on the podcast today.
So, Michael, I think one of the things that we've in America, we've seen a lot of stories about fraud recently, especially like in Minnesota and you know the effects of that. And so, oftentimes, it seems like people may think, well, fraud's just a legal problem, or legal departments can handle that. But I believe it really, just from what I've seen, it really extends far beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it can have a huge impact, whether that be kind of fraud committed on behalf of kind of a corporate or a company, or against a corporate or a company. Both kind of aspects can have a huge impact, both in terms of time and resource and kind of the energy that's required across a whole range of teams and kind of individuals within the corporate. But also externally as well, from kind of a PR perspective and kind of the wider impact in relation to, for example, companies' ability to complete M&A transactions or to kind of bid for government contracts, all that kind of stuff, because it just has, such a very wide impact. And certainly, I think in the UK, it's becoming increasingly wider. So we've just had a criminal offence introduced in the UK of a corporate being guilty of failing to prevent fraud if it didn't have reasonable kind of steps and measures in place, and that was focused on kind of fraud being committed on behalf of the company, on behalf of the corporate, rather than against it. So resource, time, but also kind of criminal exposure to liability and PR issues as well.
Yeah, and I think, years ago when I was working with the FBI, I was investigating Nigerian criminal organizations, and one of the banks, all the banks kind of centered, or a lot of the fraud centered around a bank out of Atlanta. It was, and I talked to their corporate security director, and I said, look, all the fraud's going here, and I can show you, just based it, the accounts that have been that are fraudulent, and help you prevent that. And the security director was like, he says, I know, I've told the executive leadership that they don't care. They just think it's a cost of doing business and write it off. And it's not really worth investing in additional fraud controls. And I was listening to a wiretap back then, and they were talking about this bank this is the one to go to. This this is the one that we can get away with fraud, and the reputation spread beyond Atlanta to New York, Chicago, Miami, and so they were just all kind of glomming on to that one bank. And in 2008, I think the financial crisis hit, and that bank is no longer around.
Yeah.
And it was pretty big. And I think part of it, was not necessarily that fraud case itself, but that trend of not having controls in place and just accepting risk, and it's just part of doing business. And if you don't have controls in place to adjust for when the risk level goes up, you're an institution kind of could be caught sideways.
Yeah, I agree. I think if everything is focused on a cost-benefit analysis, shall we say, then the culture within the organisation kind of gets set in a certain way. And you're right, the risks and kind of issues in terms of systems, controls, and kind of monitoring, etc., expands far outside of something like financial crime. It extends across the business at that point. And that then becomes, as you say, Jonathan, not just kind of a financial crime issue. It becomes a kind of business-wide issue. Is the company kind of facing issues more widely, which then cause it to either collapse or kind of cause serious kind of financial difficulty for it as well? And yeah, absolutely. I think if you throw on top of that the risk of kind of external either prosecuting authority or regulatory authority intervention as well, And then that's taking up resource and energy. If they identify issues, for example, with systems and controls or financial crime issues, whatever it may be, one, you kind of you're firefighting as a corporate on that front as well in relation to that external kind of investigation or review. You're also fighting internally because you've got to figure out what's going on internally and whether or not you're kind of doing the right thing or not. And then all of that becomes kind of snowballs, or becomes an effective snowball from there, often culminating in a large financial penalty being imposed by an external authority. And as you say, that's not that PR issue, absolutely, but it's also then it can become kind of a business kind of success or fail issue, as in does the level of that penalty means that business kind of is no longer viable. And that's a tricky situation to be in.
Yeah, and I think, especially when you're starting to talk with deal with regulatory authorities, and we see this on the cyber side, is the breach itself is actually can be a very short event, like just a few hours, but the dealing with the regulations afterwards extends out at least a year at best, and um, it becomes where your executive team starts getting distracted dealing with responding to the regulator, because they'll come in, they'll do a review, basically their own audit of your systems, and then come up with findings that they want the management team to address if they're within a regulated industry, and that can take a lot of just energy and effort, and to just kind of address the regulator. And I've heard that theme where it's just like this kind of exhaustion, where where the theme is, I never want to go through that. And anytime I talk to a business leader that's gone through a cyber breach, the theme is always the same. I don't want to go through that again ever. And you don't
Yeah,
have to convince them that you need to invest in security controls for cybersecurity, because they've seen the blood firsthand.
yeah,
And but it's not necessarily uh, the system itself repairing it. It's dealing with the regulations, dealing with the customers, watching the reputation diminish, and having to do damage control. So like, not only at the same time are you dealing with um, you know the regulators, you're dealing with attorneys that might have come in through insurance, trying to manage the relationship with the regulator. You're trying to manage relationships with clients and customers, notifying them, your employees as well. um, and so it's kind of fighting on all these fronts to kind of keep the ship afloat, and that can take the better part of a few years. I know that one large company, um, they're going on 5 years of having to deal with that. So and I think it's like, you probably see the same thing with fraud, is like those that have gone through a major event and those that have not.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I agree both with fraud and cyber. It's interesting. It's kind of like, as well, we see often it's kind of not just one regulator as well, or not just one prosecuting authority. It can often be a number. If kind of you have a kind of a data privacy authority. So, for example, in the UK, it's the Information Commissioner's Office, but you have kind of some form of data privacy officer or data protection agency. Plus, you may be a financial services firm subject to other regulation by SEC, CFTC, FCA here in the UK. Plus, then you kind of may throw in one or two other regulators. It kind of depends what the issues are. So you're kind of fighting, as you say, kind of fighting on a number of fronts. Then I think one of the harder points as well is customers and clients. Often, kind of in those situations, I think again, kind of cross applicable, I guess, in terms of kind of cyber and fraud issues and other things. Is kind of having to kind of conduct that engagement, notify them what's happened, often without having all of the information available to kind of allow you to have those conversations in full. So, for example, if there's kind of, again, you probably know better than I do, if there's a cyber breach or similar, you may have an idea of what's been accessed, but you may not know kind of the finite limit of what that is, or what's been done with the data that's been accessed, or the documents that have been accessed. So kind of trying to say to clients that there's been an issue, but that's kind of all we can tell you at the moment till we find out more. That's a pretty difficult conversation to have, particularly with significant and large customers who may well think, actually, well, we can go somewhere else. And I think you're right from a fraud perspective as well. Kind of like you see all very similar issues where, for example, there may have been a fraud taking place, and again, you're kind of struggling to say, actually, what's the extent of the exposure? Who's been exposed to that fraud? What's the nature of it? Which counts? All that kind of stuff. So yeah, absolutely, it's all pretty tricky and complex. I think in terms of a lot of moving parts going on at that time.
So are you seeing new fraud trends with technology? I mean, everyone talks about AI now, and we definitely see the use of AI and additional phishing emails where uh, they you know foreign-born people don't have that English barrier anymore. They just run it through AI, and it comes out with a perfectly crafted email. And then even using AI tools to do research across the
Yeah,
internet to do more accurate spear phishing, where they can pull the LinkedIn profile, match it up with a public access database, come up with a phone number, come up with the exact email, and then kind of automate that, just that first level of reconnaissance to personalize the phishing attempt. Have you seen similar trends from like a larger fraud perspective?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the tools are out there, aren't they? The people who kind of want to commit kind of a cyber attack or a fraud or similar, the tools are available for them, and therefore they're going to use those things. And as you say, it starts to remove the ability, I guess, to identify some of the issues that historically would have been used. So, as you say, kind of, you may get an email and it's kind of there are typos in random places, or certain wording just doesn't sit quite right, just doesn't kind of sit from an English language perspective or similar. Whereas now, you're right, Jonathan, in terms of the use of AI and stuff, it kind of cleans all of that up. So you might be getting emails, you might be getting mobile text messages, whatever it is, and it all seems pretty genuine and kind of pretty kind of believable, I guess, in that sense. So then it becomes a question: well, what else do you look out for? If those were kind of your red flags before, what can you look out for now in terms of red flags going forward to kind of help you try and prevent that up front? I mean, we're also seeing things like deepfake videos used a lot or increasing amounts in terms of fraud, etc. I mean, there was an example, wasn't there, not too long ago, of a board individual. I think it was the chief financial officer of a large corporate, receiving a message, seems pretty kind of reasonable and believable, saying, "Can you please jump on this call?" from the CEO. Jumps on the call, and there are a number of other board members on the call. It's a video call; they're all there, and the CEO is asking for a large amount of money to be wired immediately because there's an urgent kind of financial issue that the firm needs to address. And the CFO wired that large amount of money. Turns out the images on the screen were all deep fake images. The email that had been sent was a fake email, probably using AI to support sending that email. And if you're seeing things like that, what are the systems and controls then you need to think about to put in place to kind of stop that type of thing happening? How do you kind of address that? There must be, I guess, behind that payment being made, you're going to have to put in place additional steps or measures to kind of triple verify or double verify that issue. But if it is the CEO and they're telling you it needs to be done immediately and they're telling you the urgency of it, etc., it's difficult to kind of, I guess, difficult for people to kind of see that and kind of take a step back and go, no, this doesn't sound right to me.
Yeah, I actually looked at a way to, could you replicate that scenario? Because I think it was a British company that it had happened to, and it's become known as pretty like, the deep fake scenario to guard against.
Yeah,
And it really struck me as more than just like flipping a switch and using AI tools. This was a heist. I mean, there was like a very concentrated effort where you know, the criminals used AI tools, but it wasn't AI driven. It was like they did a level of reconnaissance to understand the CEO, the CFO, the rest of the executive leadership team. And the interesting thing to me is not only did they have to create these AI avatars that were convincing, they had to get them to talk in a way that was similar to
yeah,
those team members that was convincing. Because like in the executive leadership team, they meet on a regular basis. They know each other. They talk in a certain way. They use certain phrases, and how they were able to understand that and get it to be convincing enough for the CFO to like pull the, whereas opposed to like hearing the CEO say something he's in a manner that he might never said before. So the amount of effort they had to do to put in just the way they speak, the way they talk, and then the convincing AI images was kind of an extended effort
Yeah,
where they had to do it. And so
yeah,
it was really, like you watch like these heist movies like Ocean's 11, where you like the majority of the movies preparation, like getting the different devices and getting the people together and practicing what they're going to do. I think this scenario was very similar to that. Um, so it's in one way, it's kind of reassuring that this was a human-driven effort using AI tools. So we don't have to necessarily be concerned about AI impersonating boards across the globe. Um, but it's still, that tool's out there, and it's, I'm sure we can see more of it. I know that from a generalist perspective, it's hard to use like common tools to do a fraud. Like if you ask, how do I do a business email compromise? You'll get a warning saying, oh, you really shouldn't do that. Rethink, I can tell you about it, but I'm not going to give you a script. Of course, someone that is um, adamant and focused on doing it, they're going to find a tool that's going to do the work for them. But I'm interested, with those challenges of making a convincing deep fake fraud, are you still seeing an increase?
yeah, yeah. And I think it's also, I mean, the number of AI tools that are out there, free of charge, don't even necessarily have to pay for the vast majority of them. They are having a significant impact in terms of how fraud has been approached, but also, I suppose, the extent to which people can get involved in fraud. So the number of people who can now kind of think about actually how would I engage in a fraud, how would I undertake fraud, can I use the AI tools to assist me with that? Does that speed things up? Does it make it kind of easier, I suppose, to kind of circumvent the systems and controls that might be in place for what may historically have been non-AI supported fraud? Yeah, all of that is being done. But also I think when you think about it, it's kind of, like, there are not only kind of individuals, but there are groups out there, aren't there, who are undertaking these activities in a very organised way. It's not necessarily kind of an individual sat somewhere in a room trying to kind of figure out a fraud and kind of how to do that. This is groups of people who, as you say, they've given significant thought to kind of how to do this. They put in some background work in terms of analysis, and particularly for kind of large scale frauds, that's what they're going to need to do. But with the kind of technology and AI that's available, I'm guessing, don't know because I've never tried it myself, but I'm guessing it's far less effort and time than it would have been historically pre-AI tools, etc., to kind of get to that point of being able to commit the fraud in that kind of they're targeting. Um, yeah, it's. I mean, we deal with a lot of clients, and we kind of deal with a lot of groups who support clients in different situations as well. And I think that the general line, and not wishing to be defeatist, is, but it's a lot of catch up. It's a lot of organisations playing catch up in relation to kind of fraud prevention tools and AI and how they're being used and how to kind of try and deal with that.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you about was the UK fraud strategy, where it's highlighting the scale of fraud that affects both the individuals and businesses, and what should companies being doing now to prove that they're not just reacting to fraud, but actively preventing it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a big thing in the UK because, as I say, we've just had some legislation brought in, which um, means that for certain corporates, they can be found guilty of failing to prevent fraud by not having appropriate systems and controls in place. Um, and that's kind of, there's been a lot of press around that. Time will tell, I guess, if behaviours have kind of been changed as a result of that, as to whether or not corporates and firms and businesses are spending more time thinking about kind of their own fraud systems and controls as kind of detailed to them, so specific to them, rather than simply saying, oh, we'll have a certain technology solution or whatever it is, and we'll kind of put that in place and that'll resolve the issue. It's now requiring some very careful thought by companies and businesses around one, and this is where I think historically the main focus has been, one is kind of them being the victim of a fraud and how do they stop that happening. But then now more widely, and this is where I think the focus is shifting a little bit, is preventing fraud being committed on their behalf or by kind of an agent on their behalf, and how they go about doing that, because they're now undertaking various risk assessments to kind of figure out what does that actually mean to them. And this includes all kinds of organisations, law firms and everybody else are kind of undertaking this analysis. And I think for some organisations it's probably a lot simpler than it is for others in terms of what the risks are and how they could be kind of the victim of a fraud or kind of fraud committed on their behalf. So it's not only just, I mean, historically people had things like anti-bribery policies and gifts and hospitality policies and all this kind of thing. I'm not sure they necessarily had kind of a fraud-related policy or a kind of a anti-fraud related policy for their employees, for their agents, etc. And it's thinking carefully around actually what ought to be in that. What did we ought to be doing to prevent that happening? And how do we do it? And does that involve monitoring? Does it involve AI tools, as you mentioned before? What does it really mean to them as individual organisations and the risks that they face? There's also been a change here in the UK as well recently in terms of, and this has been expanded in terms of firms and organisations being liable for, and criminally liable for the activities of what are called their senior managers. So if a senior manager within their authority goes out and commits, for example, a fraud or a bribery offence or any other criminal offence that kind of corporate could be found guilty of, then the corporate becomes liable for the same offence automatically. So it's not a question of systems and controls, it then becomes an issue of, well, did they go and commit the criminal offence or not? Was it within their authority? If it was, it becomes very tricky.
So the fraud that the officer would have to admit would have to be related back to his position somehow, not just if he
Yes,
does the fraud
yeah.
in general.
Yeah, somehow within the authority. Yeah, if someone went out and, let's say a board member went out and defrauded, someone who lived on their street and took the money and went on holiday with the money, that's not what we're talking about. It's kind of if it's fraud or similar or any criminal offence now, and this has been the recent extension, any criminal offence that the corporate could be guilty of, then the corporate would be criminally liable or similar for that offence, whatever it may be, as long as we say, as long as it's committed kind of within their authority effectively, looking for some form of benefit or similar in terms of the organisation.
Is that causing a trend more towards continuous vetting, where, like like in the past, if you hire an individual, they'll do a background check, and if they pass the wicket, then they're hired, and that's kind of the end of HR's involvement. But now, I've seen insider threat programs, do a regular credit check, regular criminal check every year, or they have some type of service that notifies them if someone gets arrested or a DUI or
Yeah.
something along that line. They do get a notification uh, in a fairly
Yeah.
timely manner. Is that
Yeah.
Are you seeing more companies move towared that, where
Yeah,
they
it's definitely part
monitor
of
their
it.
employees?
Yeah, definitely part of it. Yeah. I think as well, I mean, I suppose the organisations that are giving a lot of thought to this are kind of almost extrapolating that and saying, well, look, what are the potential pressures or similar that could encourage or cause someone to kind of look to commit this kind of offence? And so, for example, you say things like a credit score, are they identifying people that have significant issues from a credit perspective? Does that then make them more likely to kind of engage in some form of fraudulent behaviour within the organisation, whether that be targeting the organisation, or B, on behalf of the organisation to seek to, for example, increase their commission or their remuneration through being successful in kind of generating, let's say, false invoices or similar, and what does that look like, and how could they go about doing that? So it's kind of it's using that kind of basic information, but also thinking about it, I guess, from a social engineering perspective as to what that can lead to in terms of behaviours, and kind of therefore where do they target their time, resource, etc. in terms of monitoring and review. So definitely that, but also thinking about things like more practical systems and controls around things like 4i checks rather than 2i check and all that kind of stuff, and where do they need to implement that. And what it is meaning is that kind of the resource and the investment into kind of fraud prevention or crime prevention activities becomes ever greater, because it's what they need to do, and then kind of flows into the conversation we were having earlier on around what does that look like? Is that primarily technology? Is that AI driven? Kind of what does that mean in terms of how they go about doing that?
Yeah, it's kind of like where private industry is starting to follow the government in some ways, because back in the mid '90s in the U.S. there was a large case, the Oliver James spy case, where he was arrested for spying for Russia, and he'd been receiving payments all along, and had bought a nice house in a very nice area of Washington, D.C. Was driving a high-end Jaguar. Was going on all these trips. He would host parties for his fellow CIA colleagues. And whenever it came up, hey, where's all this money going? Because he's living far beyond the means of a government employee. He's like saying, "Oh, I just inherited this money from, a passing relative." And that was his, story.
Yeah,
And no one ever checked up on it. And so that really never uh, led to that. And so when he, was arrested, they did interview him and do some damage control. The government instituted a whole program where if you worked in the intelligence community, you had to fill out every year um, what your financial situation was, and where your money came from. And so there's a lot, an increase in monitoring there. Um, I think I'm not sure how effective it was as an actual. It's probably more of a deterrence more than anything
yeah,
else, because if you're going to go spy for, against and betray your country, you're probably not going to have any problem about fabricating paperwork at that point either. And if you're receiving payments from a foreign country.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's stories like that, isn't it? It's things like that that then, and like the deepfake thing we spoke about and things, and certainly here in the UK there was kind of a banking fraud a little. This is going back quite a number of years, but it came to light because the individual took 2 weeks off on annual leave, which they hadn't done for a number of years. And an issue arose kind of during the course of that annual leave, and their kind of restrictions were that the individuals, when you're on leave, couldn't access the systems, couldn't access emails, that kind of stuff, and that effectively was one of their fraud prevention mechanisms, which was like if someone's away completely for 2 weeks, will that then trigger kind of identifying an issue that they've managed to cover up because they're constantly engaged and can constantly kind of access systems, emails, that kind of thing to do that. So we have firms, and there are a number of them, not just in the UK, who kind of implement that as one of their kind of fraud kind of prevention techniques, which is individuals have to take a 2 week block of annual leave at some point during the year, and during that 2 week block, they're not allowed access to systems or anything else. Not the most kind of technical, not the most kind of expensive, but kind of a practical kind of step that they put in place, along with a kind of a load of other controls and stuff as well. But it's thinking about things like that, isn't it, really? I think kind of how do you extrapolate that out to what are now kind of increasingly complex kind of frauds, and increasingly kind of technology-driven fraud and similar criminal behaviour.
Yeah, I've seen 1 week like a requirement to stay away in the U.S.
Yeah,
We may have less vacation time we can push people to take.
there you go.
But we may be behind you in some aspects. One of the things that we've seen from a cybersecurity standpoint is like there's a requirement for a lot of companies in the regulated space to develop a written information security plan. What they are doing to prevent cyber breaches from occurring, and then the government really doesn't tell them how to write it or what needs to go in it, but it has to be done. Um, we see, especially in cases where organizations are smaller, that they don't have a lot of resources or time, that they'll do the security plan, but they really treat it as a paper exercise. They'll download a template, they'll have the officer manager fill it out, and then it goes on the shelf. Um, do you, and I think the intent is, in the government is to you create a program that actually protects customer data as opposed to treating it as an exercise. Um, do you have any thought? Do you see the same type of trend uh, in the UK, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's. I suppose it's across a range of things, isn't it? So from a cyber kind of security perspective, data protection stuff, there are policies in place, and so firms are doing an assessment in terms of that and kind of how they react if there is an issue, and kind of what that would then look like in terms of individuals' contact and kind of steps that they would take in the immediate future after a cyber breach or a cyber attack. And I guess more widely, what we see is kind of there have been for a number of years now, a bit similar to the FCPA in the US, kind of anti-bribery policies and that kind of thing, and systems and controls around that. What we're now seeing is some of that expanding out into other criminal or potentially criminal activity, and what that looks like in terms of systems and controls around prevention of that and policies that are then put in place. Um, it's one of those things where I tend to agree. We see kind of smaller organisations who don't necessarily have the financial resource to do something kind of tailored to them specifically. So they can't go and get, I don't know, a large accountant consultancy firm come in and kind of do a whole assessment of the business, draft a 50-page policy and charge them how many hundreds of thousands of dollars or pounds. You're right, they will pick up a template from somewhere in relation to kind of those specific issues. They'll try and tailor it to them, but how much kind of it really is tailored, and how much kind of real thought they're giving to what the risks are to them as an organisation, I think remains questionable. I think often with this stuff, a bit like say you mentioned earlier on, kind of when someone's had a cyber attack or cyber breach, they're kind of like, I don't want to do that again. But it's if that's not happened yet, similar to kind of not being the victim of a fraud, or not kind of being caught up in any bribery allegations and stuff, I think organisations sometimes take a view and go, that will never really happen. It's not a key risk. A key risk for us right now is, for example, if you're a small business, keeping the customers you've got and growing those customers to generate more income. That's kind of often the key focus, rather than, I don't know, training the staff in terms of kind of fraud prevention, I guess.
Yeah, I guess there's that tendency, for anybody, like especially if you're constrained, is like focus on, the positive things, the growth, how do we make the business bring in more money? And it's only at a certain point where you start thinking, well, how do we prevent bad things from happening, as like from a fraud perspective, or decreasing hiring turnover, or looking at, or a cyber event. And that's the one thing that we really kind of press upon business leaders is, any responsible business leader is going to look at metrics on a regular basis, whether it's, your financial performance, your credit, your production capacity, whatever the business is. They're going to look at a variety of different metrics on a regular basis. And the one thing we make about the point about cyber is you got to include cybersecurity risk in there as well, because that's the one that, if you're not monitoring it, you have no idea where your risk is trending. And you can kind of get an idea, like if sales slows, business leaders probably there's gonna something feel, you can kind of see that coming. Where from a cyber perspective, that's the one thing you don't feel. and it can gobble up a company overnight. And so we really kind of push, this is not a IT issue, it's a business risk issue, and you have to look at it from the, from from the, the front office, or the executive leadership team needs to understand that, and think of it as their problem, not the guy in the back who's running the computers, because it can affect the organization far beyond a defective laptop could. And so I wonder, when you investigate some of these frauds, are there things that you see that uh, like from a culture standpoint, or things that you think, and leadership kind of missed, something they should have been doing here? And I wonder if is that something you see right away?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that we do see it. It's kind of, it's one of those things whereby it may be a new organisation that we're dealing with. It may be one that we've dealt with before. It kind of depends. But I think what you will sometimes see is that senior individuals within the organisation may have been allocated kind of certain responsibilities within kind of chains of reporting and that kind of thing within the organisation. But sometimes it's kind of one of two, I suppose one of three things. A certain kind of issue isn't actually kind of linked all the way up to a senior individual, and that's possibly an error or something that needs rectifying. Sometimes it is, but there's kind of a break in that chain of communication, and that can cause issues where, for example, either incorrect information is kind of put up that chain of reporting, or omissions are made in that chain of reporting, or questions aren't asked on the way back down in kind of in terms of that chain. And the third kind of circumstance is sometimes when the senior individual doesn't really understand what they're being kind of given the responsibility for in terms of that chain of reporting and monitoring. And that can often apply to kind of new developments. So things like, I don't know, AI or technology and things and such like, or cyber breaches. I mean, it's interesting when you'll go in and you kind of go and speak to organisations, and you can ask questions around certain things, and it's kind of like, with hindsight, it's a wonderful thing. Obviously, hindsight's great, but it's kind of like, why did you think that individual would be able to understand the information they were receiving in relation to something which is highly technical and completely outside of their sphere of experience? May well be it's because you've got a finite number of people on the board, or kind of senior within the organisation, and therefore it had to be allocated somewhere, and that was the best kind of fit, but it still kind of didn't really kind of address the issues, or kind of similarly that individual within the senior management wasn't, for example, given, I don't know, additional training, additional support to understand what those issues were and what they ought to be asking about. In the UK more recently, we've had, certainly in the financial services world, the authorities have sought to increase that senior manager level accountability. So each senior manager within a regulated financial services firm has had to have kind of a statement of responsibilities, what they're responsible for. There's a governance map created within the organisation that allocates those responsibilities. And they are increasingly kind of held to account both internally and externally in relation to how they supervise, monitor, understand what's happening within those specific streams or reporting lines within the organisation. And I think that's changed that in that sector. That has changed how senior managers kind of approached it, particularly as well because, not being cynical, hopefully, but because they are individually liable if something happens in those chains that they are responsible for. So you tend to find they're a bit more interested in what's going on, why, and kind of what the issues are and what the risks are, and kind of where can they add additional support. Whereas I think in sectors outside of that, maybe that kind of drive, maybe that kind of external pressure isn't really there, possibly. But I don't know what you think, Jonathan. From a kind of cyber perspective, I don't know if you see the same kind of thing.
We haven't seen it from a personal liability standpoint
Okay.
necessarily. I think we're still kind of increasing the number of types of firms that would fall under regulating requirements to them, but
Yeah.
I haven't seen, I see that more from a fraud or from a financial responsibility perspective, and a lot of these regulations are driven by a certain incident that comes out, and then we have a reg that kind of responds to it. So we haven't seen it from a personal liability standpoint yet, but it may be coming.
Yeah.
So one of the things is you lead the EU UK sanctions team at K&L Gates. How has sanctions compliance there changed from a fairly niche legal topic to a core business risk issue?
Yeah. Hugely, hugely. I mean, if I think back to kind of 2020, 2021, sanctions compliance was, I mean, organisations were addressing it and it was on their agenda, but it was nowhere near kind of as high up their agenda or kind of level of importance as it now is for a lot of organisations and corporates. I mean, just in terms of the volume of sanctions that are in place, and obviously primarily in relation to Russia following the invasion of Ukraine, but for other kind of territories as well, things like Iran now, Cuba, Sudan, Syria, etc., and kind of the changes in geopolitical approach to all of these different territories and things it's significantly ramped up kind of the importance of sanctions compliance and how firms are looking to kind of address that and how they go about seeking to ensure that takes place. And that then has, I think, almost inevitably, I guess, expanded out into bringing things like export control higher up the agenda as well, because it's often kind of tied in together in terms of kind of the restrictions in place. For example, leading to, in the UK, the creation of a new body, OTC, in relation to trade sanctions and implementation and compliance, which didn't exist a few years ago, but because of kind of the nature of the importance and the focus on that, kind of a huge expansion in terms of compliance operations, resourcing, and again looking at. No, I suppose it's a constantly moving framework within which firms and individuals are operating from a sanctions perspective. But also, you may well find, or we find, that kind of clients, corporates, are often caught up by a number of sanctions regimes and trying to figure out the conflicts between those and how people should operate in those circumstances. And now the US have had secondary sanctions for a number of years now, but UK and EU are expanding into that space. So it's not necessarily kind of the risk of direct sanctions in terms of, for example, facilitating the Russian military or similar. It's now kind of organisations facilitating, for example, the transportation of Russian crude oil, which then enables the Russian economy to receive finances and injections of cash, etc. So those kind of organisations now are becoming kind of significantly at risk of sanctions by EU, UK, US. So kind of risk exposure is pretty huge nowadays in that space. But yeah.
Yeah, well, when you listed all those countries, from Iran to Cuba to Russia, it really kind of drove home the point that, yeah, this is probably far more active than it had been like a decade ago, where you'd see sanctions against probably one or two particular countries, and now it's changing, from month to month as far as sanctions and whether they're on or off, and I could see that it could be a real challenge. Are those driven primarily through the U.S. kind of shifting its interest across the globe, or is it through UK, EU actions, or are you? I'm just curious, like, how do you? Where do you follow the guidance, I guess?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, it's kind of it's now at the stage, I think, where I suppose geopolitical action has an impact, potentially as well, kind of not necessarily where it was originally intended to have an impact. So, for example, if we look at the Iran situation right now, the impact in terms of oil transportation and kind of the availability of oil and petroleum related goods, etc., being restricted as a result of the activity in Iran, that then has had a knock-on impact in terms of the sanctions regimes and how they approach Russian crude, for example, and related petroleum products, whereas historically there may have been quite significant restrictions on that. Some of those have been lifted, some of it around restrictions on purchasing Russian crude, and kind of then amends being made to say actually you can't buy Russian crude that's not started to be transported yet, but if it has already started to be transported or is in transport, then you can potentially purchase that, and how that works, and there's a price cap and all kinds of stuff that relate to that. But it's those interactions as well, and where you've then got certain regimes, let's say sanctioning entities or individuals in China because of their support for different other activities that are going on that kind of Russia, UK, EU and others are trying to prevent, they then become subject to sanctions. For example, there's recently been an entity in Indonesia, a refinery, that's been sanctioned because of its involvement in refining Russian crude that was being transported into Indonesia to allow that to be fine. So it becomes it becomes increasingly all-encompassing, and similarly where you've got organisations or corporates who, for example, may sell a certain item, but they'll sell it, I don't know, from the UK to EU or whatever it may be. Questions now need to be asked around, okay, well, is that the end user? Is that where it's going to stay, whatever you're kind of exporting or selling? Or actually, is that then being transferred on, and where is that going to end up? Because there now becomes an increasing exposure that if at some point down the chain those items or goods find themselves either in a sanctioned territory or in the possession of a sanctioned or designated individual or kind of corporate, you potentially face kind of prosecution liability for that as a result. And I think that kind of applies. It's kind of almost this expansion, isn't it, I guess, more generally, and some of the stuff we've spoken about around kind of increased corporate exposure, or increased kind of company exposure to criminal prosecution or criminal liability or financial penalties, and kind of all the issues that then come with that. And the burden is being placed, I think, increasingly on the corporates and kind of companies, businesses, to try to stop all of this happening. And that for organisations of a certain size is kind of a pretty massive responsibility to place on them, that's going to cost them a lot of money. And therefore it goes back to, again, something we've been speaking about, kind of what's on the agenda, what's the priority. Is the priority kind of commercial continuity? They're making its business, they're kind of a cash generative, revenue generative. How much do they want to allocate of that to all this other stuff that's going on? Because what's the potential exposure to them? How likely is it that they find themselves in a situation where they may be prosecuted, may be fined, etc.? But I think that risk of that kind of fine and prosecution is only ever increasing at the moment.
Do you find that the regulatory authorities for sanctions are, increasing their actual actions against companies? And
Yeah.
because you talk about, do companies take that risk, and like how likely is it that the government's going to investigate and come after us for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think externally looking into the US, OFAC has always seemed to be very active in that space. But then it's one of those questions, isn't it, around kind of, okay, say OFAC fine, I don't know, let's say 30 corporates, I don't know, just picking a number, 30 corporates in a year in the US. How many corporates are operating in the US during that same year? And kind of what does that look like in terms of a percentage of those that potentially have kind of had some form of connection with sanctions or similar? Kind of what's the real risk to them of that level of enforcement? And I think we're kind of seeing that in the UK and EU as well. We're kind of, EU and UK authorities are increasing their enforcement activity, definitely. There are more investigations, there are increasing number of financial penalties and that kind of thing coming out. But I do wonder how many corporates and businesses are out there who either don't really think about the issues, or don't really want to spend time, money, resource on those issues because they will sit there and say, well, you know what? The likelihood of someone kind of coming to prosecute us is probably pretty small in the grand scheme of everything else that's going on. I think the challenge with that approach is it only has to happen once generally. And then you face a whole host of other issues.
Yeah, it's a bit of a crapshoot, and we see the same on the cyber side. Do you invest in preparing for an incident, like doing the incident planning, putting controls in place, and it's time and resources that you could put somewhere else. But
Yeah,
if an event happens, you can't go back and spend that same money. It
yeah,
costs 5 to 10 times as much
yeah,
at best. And I think that's sometimes a realization that some companies don't have. That it's like the saying, the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But that's really the gamble that they're taking when they delay these risk mitigation efforts.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And again, it goes back to possibly where we started, I guess, is that a bit like you guys see from the cyber perspective, and then kind of we see as well, kind of in other areas, is some of these things. It only needs to happen once because it can be business ending, and therefore it's kind of at that point, I'm sure everybody would look back and go, I really wish I'd spent a bit of time or money in that space just to put in place some, could be relatively basic systems and controls and monitoring, who knows, that might have kind of prevented that happening. But that's with hindsight, isn't it? And it's not necessarily where people want to prioritise their spending and their resource.
Yeah. So kind of on that theme, and kind of to um, wrap us up, what is one question you wished clients asked more before trouble comes up?
It's a good question. Um, I think it would have to be kind of. I suppose it's what are the key risks to our business in this space? What do we as an organisation or a corporate need to focus on as the key issues? Kind of trying to, I don't know, people use the phrase boil the ocean and that kind of thing. It's one of the key issues that we really should focus on in terms of these risks. We're never going to address every risk. Being practical, being realistic, that you're not going to stop every risk kind of coming to fruition that you could think of. But what are the key ones? And then do we have the people, the technology, the kind of the support that's needed to address those risks? Because if we don't, where are we going to get that from? And that for me is kind of, I think, where it requires someone just to ask those questions kind of up front and challenge the responses that they're getting as well.
Yeah. And I guess I'll ask one more uh, question to follow up is like you talk about addressing those specific risks. Is there an emerging risk that you see now that should look obvious to everyone 5 years from now?
If there was, I could be a very profitable individual, couldn't I, at that point? We'll revisit this in 5 years' time and see if I had any idea what I was talking about, obviously. What do I think curious now is that would be people should we'll look back in 5 years' time. I think it's got to come back to the conversation around AI, hasn't it, really? I think that's what we have to come back to. I know it's tricky because I don't know about you, Jonathan, but every kind of meeting or every kind of training or every kind of conference at the moment has AI somewhere in the kind of the program or the conversation that's happening. But I think it is. I suppose it's kind of, is it AI or is it kind of what tools? It's almost trying to kind of foresee, I guess, what tools will be being used in 5 years' time that you can potentially try and get ahead of now.
Mhm.
But that's a far easier thing to say than to do, I think. And I don't know if that kind of accords with what you see from a cyber perspective or not.
I am sure like you said, will have something to do with AI and how it's used and how it's applied. There's just so many different perspectives right now, and it seems like it's it's the Wild West where, people are trying all sorts of different things and starting new companies and trying to apply it in new ways. And I would imagine if we're, 5 years out, it'll probably be kind of similar to the dot-com boom or any other technology where, you've had 1,000 companies stand up and those will all be gone, I'm sure, and there'll probably be some centralized players. Um, I would and there's a lot of concern about replacing jobs and employees and how do we take care of that? And I think that's probably going to be one of those concerns is like if you if AI allows a company to lay off 20% of its workforce and that has the same effect for every company, that has a economic and national security perspective where and I would imagine that there'd be more government regulation that comes in because of that, as far as how can companies use AI. There may be AI job rights replace, I don't know. I think
Yeah,
we're going to probably see some development on the regulation standpoint. I would hope so. And I think that's something the government's always struggled to keep up with technology, have the regulations match, what the environment is actually like. So I imagine that we'll probably see uses of AI just in ways that we haven't foreseen. And
yeah.
I hope the government is playing a role to make that safe for your average citizen.
I tend to agree. I think if I look back as a kind of a more recent analogy, if we look at things like crypto and crypto assets and things, when it first started, as you say, kind of, I use your phrase, kind of Wild West, it was kind of like a whole range of things were going on. That's kind of started to narrow down, I think, but we're also now seeing regulation brought in for crypto assets and crypto exchanges and stuff. So I think you're probably right. There will be almost inevitably some form of regulation, oversight, and monitoring brought in. I suppose the key question is going to be, isn't it, is that regulation or monitoring ahead of the game, or is it kind of trying to catch up? I guess we'll wait and see on that.
Yeah. Well, Michael, I really enjoyed having you on the podcast and talking to you and just having some great insight on sanctions and fraud regulations. And so, all right, I'll put down a place marker for 5 years to reconnect. It'll
Thanks
probably be
very
two
much.
AI avatars talking to each other at that point.
Absolutely.
But hopefully that's not the case. But really enjoyed talking to you and thank you so much for sharing.
Andrew, thanks, Jonathan. Thanks for the opportunity to be on the podcast.
Thank you.